Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me. Today I want to talk to you about a contentious topic because it's very close to the bone for a lot of Australians, and anything that's close to the bone will always engender passionate responses one way or the other. And it's about mandatory vaccination. Is it a good idea? So what I thought simply of doing is just looking at as many arguments for it, and then looking at as many arguments as possible against it, and then looking at some of the statistical figures and the science that we know about this disease, and then come to some kind of a conclusion. So first of all, the first reason for mandatory vaccination is obviously protecting the citizens of each country, so individual health of our citizens in Australia. Secondly, protecting the community. So we know that disease spreads from one person to the next, and that the Delta strain, while being less virulent, is certainly more infectious, about 50 to 55% more infectious than the Alpha strain. And therefore, by minimizing community transmission, there's less strain on the hospital system, which means less people end up in ICU, less on ventilators, and hopefully less dying as well. Number 3, the easing of restrictions. Wouldn't we all like that? Fourthly, the speedy opening of borders, so to allow therefore domestic travel and international travel as well. And fifthly, perhaps some of you may not have considered this, but it's been offered as a potential reason favouring mandatory vaccination, that it would help to get the fence sitters off the fence, and by offering them payments for vaccination. Particularly, this will be an attractive thing for those who maybe are poorer or need the income, but also for those who perhaps couldn't really bother one way or the other, getting vaccinated or not, to help bring them over the line. On the other hand, the reasons against mandatory vaccination are several as well. And one is that there's the potential side effects. So these are health issues. There are those who have, and both the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer and Moderna, they all have their limitations. With Pfizer and Moderna, or Pfizer particularly, there's myocarditis or pericarditis, so inflammation of the heart muscle or the tissue around the heart. It doesn't usually result in death, but certainly can be very serious. Very rarely, but it's one of the extreme cases, and somebody may have a legitimate reason for not wanting to use or receive that particular vaccine. The AstraZeneca, we've heard a lot about over the months, and again, there's 26 in a million under 60 who will end up with blood clots, 18 in a million over the age of 60 who will end up with blood clots. According to ATAGI, the Australian Technical Advisory Group for Immunisation, ATAGI, that's where these figures are, 5% of those who get blood clots will end up dying, unfortunately. However, this is, in the UK, it's more than three times higher, which is 18% of those who get blood clots, in fact, die. So, fear of health. The other reason against it could be those who don't want to be vaccinated for ethical reasons, for instance. Again, there could be religious, moral, whatever it is, but ethical reasons, people have them. Vaccinated with no guarantee against getting sick. So unfortunately, vaccinating means health is the risk of sickness is minimized, but it's not guaranteed. People still get sick, as we found out in that report of the survey done published in the Melbourne Age a few weeks ago, where 10% of those who had been doubly vaccinated, in fact, these are health workers, 10% of those who had been doubly vaccinated still got sick with COVID, and 25% of those who had been singly vaccinated got sick with COVID. So it's no bulletproof vest, but it does minimize, and hopefully in some cases significantly, others less so. It would also minimize, this is a con, the vaccinated will still have to wear masks. So it's no guarantee that it's going to get rid of these either. That's at least what we've been told. That vaccinated can still, if they can get sick, they can still also pass on the sickness. So vaccination is not a bulletproof vest. It's a good way forward. It's a great way forward. And I say all these things as someone who actually thinks vaccination is a good thing for the world in the 225-year history that it's been around. But it's not a bulletproof vest. So, continuing to read through these lists, that the vaccinated, or unvaccinated for that matter, will not be able to congregate in large numbers. That the loss, obviously, of human freedom and self-determination. People are born free. We live in a free country. People should be free to decide. And coercion is never an acceptable thing within a democratic society. Even though the argument's been put forward that, well, in conscription, we don't give people a choice, Well, yeah, I suppose they have a choice. They can be put in prison with conscriptions or whatever. But we force people to pay taxes, a whole lot of other things. So this, they argue, the proponents of mandatory vaccination argue that this could be another reason. Well, that's why I'm putting it forward as a con, because coercion is not something that people like. The loss of livelihood, the threat of jobs. Many people have been threatened with loss of jobs, and this obviously can't be a healthy thing. That's a con against mandatory vaccination. And lastly, and certainly not exhaustive, that it creates a social discrimination. Two classes of people, the vaccinated, the unvaccinated, and those who choose not to be vaccinated for whatever reason end up being demonized by those who are vaccinated. And so it breaks down that solidarity that should exist amongst people of different nation. So these are just some of the reasons, the pros and the cons that I've been able to think up of. But let me just share with you now the actual statistics, the figures, and then we'll talk a bit about the science that we actually know and hopefully to come to a conclusion. The number of active cases so far at the moment in New South Wales are 22,649. 22,649 active cases in New South Wales. Of these active cases, there are 1,036 actually in hospital. So that's 4.6% of the active cases. Of that same active cases, 173 of them are in ICU. So that's 0.8% of that total number of active cases. And then 96 of them are on ventilators. So that's 0.4% of that total number of active cases. So active cases, 22,649, hospitalized, 1,036, so 4.6% of them. ICU, 0.8%, so it drops markedly. And then on ventilators, it drops significantly again, 0.4%. However, the overall death toll that has been there has been pretty consistent at about 0.4%. So it's 4 in 1,000 roughly with the Delta strain end up dying. And most of the people who die because, as we know, of underlying conditions. So whether it's heart disease of some kind or obesity or diabetes or renal failure, whatever, along with COVID. It's not just COVID, or they have some kind of a compromised immune system. So the death percentage is actually 0.4%. This is with the Delta strain. The Alpha strain was considerably more deadly, about 5 times more deadly. And you can get these figures yourself on the website, so there's nothing secret here that I've worked out. The interesting thing, though, to work out is that this is a disease where 99.3% of cases are actually mild to moderate. 99.3% of cases are mild to moderate. So mandating vaccination for a disease where 99.3% of cases are mild to moderate seems to me like a very strong reaction indeed. If, on the other hand, for instance, 10% of those who got the disease, like with the Spanish flu, ended up dying, that's a much, much stronger incentive for mandatory vaccination. Or like with the case of the bubonic plague, where 33%, 1 in 3, or in some areas, 2/3 of the people died. That is another question altogether. So the figures here tell us their own story. Unfortunately, however, there's a great deal of fear that's being put around. And fear is not a healthy way to govern a democratic and free society. Fear is not how God wants us to live, and this is a pastoral message. God doesn't want us to live in fear. The number of times we hear Christ saying to his apostles in the Gospels, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. So I say these figures to help us maintain the objective reality. The other things that we know is that transmission is going to happen regardless. Let's assume for a moment that 100% vaccination, double vaccination occurred. Is that going to just all of a sudden stop transmission? No. We learn to live with it. We learn to live with the disease. Hopefully it'll reduce greatly the number of people who will be very sick or sick enough to be in ICU or on ventilators, but there will still be people who will be in ICU and will be on ventilators and people who will die. There will still be that. The interesting figure that is consistently 0.4% with the Delta strain, even though the figures of double vaccination are constantly growing, the death rate seems to be pretty constant. I don't know what else to make of that. Hopefully that will change and drop, but it doesn't seem to be happening so far. So there's something to be made of that. But when you boil down all the reasons for or against the mandatory vaccination, the pros, I think you could boil them down to about two. Health of the individual and minimizing communal transmission. All the others kind of follow on from that. So they're the two in favor of mandatory vaccination. Against, probably the two strongest ones would be those, the loss of human freedom and two, the loss of livelihood. I mean, some might want me to add, the fact that the fear of potential side effects, which is certainly a very serious one as well, even though most side effects are mild to moderate. And then the fact that, we still can get sick. But to boil it down, really the loss of freedom and the loss of livelihood and possibly the fear of the side effects. So when you look at those two things, and you look at the fact that 99.3% of cases are mild to moderate, it seems to me like going too far to mandate vaccination when it's in fact most people, the vast majority of people, will make a full recovery. Granted that there are some people, about 10 to 30% of sufferers, who will have what's called long COVID. That means the symptoms persist for longer than 3 months after they have recovered. So that's probably a topic for another time. So if you had to ask me, is it a good idea for mandatory vaccination? I would say not, because the harm that stands to be done by eroding the social fabric and the solidarity amongst citizens and the loss of livelihood in fact stands to outweigh the good that's going to be achieved by having everybody, or even 80%, 100% doubly vaccinated, when in fact the disease can still spread, people will still die because there'll be people with underlying conditions, and if the death rate at the moment tells us anything, it's pretty consistent at 0.4%. And I say this as someone who actually supports the value of vaccination. If you've enjoyed this video, please press like and subscribe. Feel free to tell me what you think in the comments below, and I look forward to joining me again at the next video very soon.